all bureaucracy out of the window, we can talk about geography. So, what is the geography of Netherlands? This is the Netherlands. This is how it looks like. I don't know how much you can actually see on the screen because my camera might block it. But the main idea is just you can see my pointer that you just have a very big center in the Netherlands, an economic center, a population center, which is called the Randstad, which is consisting of a couple of cities. So you have Amsterdam, The Hague, Utrecht, Rotterdam, Haarlem too, and all of these here together form what's called the Randstad. The majority of the Netherlands lives here. A lot of economic activity happens here too, sort of like big decisions being made. Like The Hague has, like, of course, the ICC's headquarters. It has the Dutch Parliament. Like a lot of politics happen here. Rotterdam has the port, so all our exports happen here. Amsterdam has, of course, an airport, but also has like a lot of like business centers. Same thing for like Utrecht. So like a lot of like economic activity happens in this region. Um, there's also oft times where you'll have a lot of like jokes about Amsterdam is like the big urban city, which means it has all these hippies, these a lot of like left wing nuts like communist socialists like live in these like big urban centers, which is true. But also if you do look at um like votes for like right wing parties, there's still also a lot of like people here because also the kind of like Wall Street bros, finance bros also live in these kind of like places. So it is not necessarily always like the divide does exist between urban and rural, but it isn't as clear that you have as many like super duper left wing or super duper right wing people in these parties. Like Amsterdam does overall have some more left leaning people also in its local municipalities, uh, but that's just a general thing with urban cities. It's not like super extreme on a national level. So what else do you then have? Well, if you see here, most likely none of you know or have known anything about this if you haven't been to the Netherlands, like Friesland, Groningen, Drenthe, Overijssel. In the north, they are just kind of like, especially in this part of the north, so these three provinces, they do have some economic activity. They have, for example, like farmland. Groningen, for example, is important for some companies, just like Leeuwarden. Uh, but it isn't a very big hub because what tends to happen is you have a lot of like old people living here because a lot of like young people who want to have careers and that kind of stuff go to, for example, Groningen to study or go to Amsterdam to study, and they also take jobs there and that kind of stuff. So there are a lot of old people living here and a lot of like young people here, which is kind of screwing up the population, socially, economically, and also healthcare wise. It just means that it isn't necessarily great. Like I said, a lot of farmland here. There's some activity also with fishing, of course, because it's near the sea, but it isn't very economically active. Um, then, of course, you have Overijssel and Flevoland. Fun fact about Flevoland, this is a province we made ourselves because we were like, you know what we need? More land. And we need more land for more agriculture. So what we basically did was we pumped out just a lot of the sand in the IJsselmeer, so just this specific body of water. And then we're like, we're gonna eat it here, and then we're gonna make a province, and then we're gonna make it our land. So this is also, mostly just agricultural area. There's of course nuances here, but it isn't very, very like it doesn't have the same kind of like economic power that these regions have. Now, let's go a bit to the south, because you have, of course, Zeeland, which isn't very economically active. Does have something to do with fishing, because as you can see, a lot of like water here. We also have a lot of delta works here, because of a very major um, rise in water that happened at some point, like a water storm, which then basically flooded this area. Um, but also hasn't been able to be very economically active. Doesn't really have as many ports as you maybe would say compared to Rotterdam, because there's actually a river flowing here. Then in the south, you have North Brabant and Limburg, which is culturally different in the ways that it tends to be more Catholic. Also, things like Carnival, which are like the big parties, and Brazil with like all these things. Something similar in the Netherlands, but then people dress up. It's culturally kind of like different. Also, interestingly, socially, people with these accents are kind of like seen as kind of like maybe not as smart or kind of like weird and that kind of stuff, which is a cultural difference compared to the rest, where even if you have different accents from the north, you don't have that specific stereotype assigned to it. Does this mean this is just kind of like a poor farmers region? Actually, not necessarily, because here, for example, Eindhoven is a pretty important city in the Netherlands because it has a lot of like tech companies and technical companies. The reason is actually very pragmatic. There's a technical university or applied university here, which has a lot of like good research about like um, it has like a very quick car that drives on solar panels that is basically just on top of it. It has also like very big companies here. So it has like ASML, which is like a company that makes machines that makes chips, which is like a monopoly on it. And this is like a big science hub that you have here. Somewhere in this area, I kind of forgot to look it up. You also have Wageningen, which also does do research, and that's more specifically also for food and agriculture. And it's also kind of like one of the European leading kind of like institutions that are there. So it is also a specific hub that you have. And like Groningen, of course, also have like universities also does have some hub. Arnhem is also some economic hub. Historically, the way it developed, it actually has a lot of like companies for the energy transition, consultancies, that kind of stuff, are in Arnhem. That's just the way it historically worked. So that's kind of like a small hub that you have here. Nijmegen, city where I'm from, oldest city in the Netherlands, close to Germany. It also has a university, but doesn't have a very unique kind of like economic output. Just wanted to highlight it because it's a cool city. And then also Limburg, you do have kind of like a similar issue where it is kind of like agricultural in a lot of ways. It does have kind of like social culture kind of like differently. Doesn't have really that many major like economic hubs. Like Maastricht is kind of like the close to it. It's kind of like the Maastricht is kind of like the Groningen of the south. This is where you have the most progressives, and here there is some conservatism because it is more rural areas. So why am I telling you all of this information? Well, there another kind of like generic motion that has been said in notes before is should we invest more or should we prioritize investing in the Randstad or should we invest in regions outside of it? And then sometimes people have this conception, well, these are smaller cities, they don't really have any economic infrastructure, they don't really have any like competitive edge, so we really have to start from the bottom, yada yada. All of that is not true because there are just things that people have already catered to. So, like I said, RNM consultancy for energy transition, you could build it out to more general consultancy, which would mean that you could have less pressure on Amsterdam, less people just want to live here, less housing crisis in Amsterdam. You can expand the RNM because it has many spaces you can still build because it's not as busy, all this kind of stuff. Similarly, you could say there's just already a lot of like network effects assisting. For example, in Wageningen for companies who want to do something technical with food. If you want to do something with actual like applied sciences, you could also go to Eindhoven. So you don't actually need to build that many things because there's already network effects. It's just kind of like leading people go from the Randstad, which is very busy, which has too many people, to now go to other places and make those more attractive. Um, Other arguments you could still run, of course, are well, the Randstad is popular for a reason. So if you build here, you will have more network effects. So if you build one more apartment complex or one more like business complex, a lot of the business will have significantly more benefits from living so close, basically close to all these good companies. But it's also one of those things where kind of like it's not kind of like a zero sum game. It's also about what kind of things are you investing in? Because it's not just about a business center in Amsterdam. It's just a business center in Amsterdam versus kind of like a technical center in Eindhoven, because that's where you would be competing to for Eindhoven. Um, so yeah, so this is kind of like a way that you can think about that nuance. You could also maybe talk about why it might be good specifically for the north. So again, so if you have more people staying in Groningen or maybe in Assen or in Leeuwarden, all these cities in the north, that means more young people will be staying there, which is good because then you don't just have only great people there, like old people there, and then you also maybe better healthcare there because there's more people spending there. You have more economic business going on, benefits, all this kind of stuff. So this is kind of like an understanding of the geography of the Netherlands. And also from this, I'm going to talk a bit more about the politics and how this also influences um, everything. So the first thing is to talk about the Bible Belt. So as you see here, it kind of like looks like a seatbelt. It is in red and blue. This is to do just with specific party do the people vote on. So the Christian Union is just, like I said, a Christian party. It is center. It is conservative, but not super duper conservative. So they will be against euthanasia. They will be, I think, overall in favor of uh, gay marriage and all this kind of stuff. But it's kind of like more like conservative and not super duper like progressive and that kind of stuff. The SGP is way more conservative. Kind of like give you an idea. This is a party who doesn't have any women on like the party list. And like also in like the internal party, like the board members and that kind of stuff are no women. Um, and kind of like more women conservative, like women like needs to like women are naturally biologically or because God wants it to be more in the house and men need to work more, all of that kind of stuff. Very much against abortion. Um, Maybe not against gay rights explicitly, but I also don't think that they would very much be people who would be if let's say it would be proposed and would get a majority, to be in the opposition if such a thing would happen. So it is more conservative, more radical, um, and this has a couple of like political and social implications. So the first thing is the SGP, for example, always has a steady three seats because no one's going to vote SGP except for people who already vote SGP, and people who vote for SGP are not going to vote for anyone else because it's too much of a radical party. So this basically means that it's always steady. It will never be part of a coalition, maybe a very right wing one. Um, does do some stuff on the representation side, but of course that doesn't mean that nothing's going to change there. If you would form like a, I don't know, like a electoral threshold, this would be one of the parts that would definitely be out of it. Um, of course, also socially and culturally, this is a Bible Belt, so these are very Orthodox Protestants, and they are conservative. So this means that they, you know, if a woman wears too short of a dress, definitely a lot of gossip around. A lot of people will like say this is bad. If you are gay, there might be feelings about, well, we might accept you as gay, but you shouldn't act gay, or even just not that, just not accepting to being gay and saying that this can be changed. If it comes to creationist stories, they also have an education. They will say, well, look, we need to teach you evolution, but we'll do it with a wink, wink, because actually we do not believe that evolution is true, but we just have to learn this for the state exam, all this kind of stuff. So once in a while, there's always a story in the news which is about this conservative area. Um, this is also important because the Netherlands does get framed as like a very progressive society, and I think in a lot of ways it is. One of the First Nations to make gay marriage legal. We are quite we don't have like political parties talking about like trans people in sports. Like it might be a discussion online, but not necessarily parties who are really hardlining these kind of things and using them, as maybe the Republicans are in states like Florida. But we are also do have like conservative areas in which a lot of things can be changed. And this is important whenever you have a social movement motion, or when you just talk about the Netherlands as like a cultural place, and when you talk about like a dominance of a specific thing for the Netherlands, or maybe even in general, is that even if a nation is progressive, there's still a lot of areas where a lot of things do still matter and a lot of things do still change and still need to be changed. So this is important, like context to know that, and also maybe to explain what does us politically do, what parts do get elected, kind of stuff. Um, yeah. So let's then go to another geography. So this is just going to be more of a historic side. I'm not going to go talk about every single detail because again there are many pictures here, but just got like a general idea of how things are developing for Netherlands. So in general, you see here, especially from like 86 to like 2006, there are basically two parties who are quite big. So the kind of like, I don't know what this color is, it's kind of like a light orange nudish color. This is a Labour Party in the Netherlands, and then the green one is the CDA, and the other party that you'll see a lot is the blue one is the VVD, which is center right. These are kind of like the classic big three parties. So Labour, left leaning, CDA has always like placed itself more like a farmer, more rural, kind of like right, conservative, all this kind of stuff. And the VVD has always placed itself like center right, kind of like party, law and order, kind of like good economics, all that kind of stuff. And as you can see, what tends to happen is in like more populous areas, like in cities, there's even then still changes in who do they vote for. So there are a lot of like changes here, for example, like CDA, but then also sometimes it is Labour and sometimes it's VVD. So this is what I meant with there's not always a very clear hub where there's always the Labour Party is the majority here and that kind of stuff. Because this is what this map shows the majority of people vote for it. And as you can also see, which is kind of like interesting, is that Labour has been able to talk a lot about this region, which tends to be a bit more poor, tend to be a bit more less economically active, kind of like laborers, farmers, all this kind of stuff. But as you can see later on, after the 2000s, they kind of lost a lot of that to either the VVD, which has happened with the way the Pacific Coalition works, and also kind of like to the CDA, which is also like a farmers party, where they kind of like lost ground to those kind of like spaces. So another thing to kind of like note, and this is important, is you have two like way more like right wing parties. So these are like LPF. I'm not going to talk detail about it, but just assume it's very right wing, and also the PVV. So this is yellow. As you can see, 2023 became the majority party. But what kind of happened is a lot of guys like from the esteemed three, so the VVD, the CDA, and the Labor, a lot of them became hardliners for the PVV. And as you'll also see, is the BBB also became quite big in these rural areas and kind of like have taken over the the votes from like the potentially like CDA also been more rural, more farmer friendly, those kind of stuff, or even the labor where they try to say we're going to give you a lot of money because people like the PVV also promise a lot of like money, but then also say we give you a lot of money, but also we hate migrants, so we're going to help you on both those fronts. And this kind of like shows you the struggle, especially from the left, because a lot of lost coalitions, you basically had no Labour Party being either in the biggest, having the most votes. Um, or being in the coalition in the first place. And this kind of like shows what parts are taking over and why. Part of this is just like I said, from the social, cultural kind of like context and economic context I talk about. So again, if there is like economic activity in your place and you are already older, you're more prone to listen to more radical views of like migrants and seeking a job and like why you need to change that and all this kind of stuff. Because even though it might be progressive, we still also have a lot of conservative people in these places. So yeah. So this should be, I think, just kind of like a general overview of how this kind of like specific parties lost seats. And then this is just the most recent one. And on this, I'll end the video. So as you can see, the PVV has kind of like done the same thing again, where a lot of like the major hubs that we saw here, like Amsterdam, Utrecht, Nijmegen, Arnhem, like the progressive areas, they tend to like lose on to other parties. So for example, D66, which is a center progressive party, and it's more the rural areas in which they still have a lot of like stake. Um, same is actually true for to a certain extent the BBB. So the Farmers Party also does have quite some like in the rural areas, but they haven't fallen off very very much. I'll go into detail later about it why. And what you tend to see is like in some of the places, especially for example in the north, there's quite some like swing going on. So you still have, for example, CDA being quite big. So going back to that rural roots that we saw, there's also some D66, there's Mirror Center. Also it tends to do quite well for like more educated areas. So for example, Amsterdam, even like here, which is like Arnhem, Nijmegen, this region. And Utrecht, which is here, but like so as well as like these centers, they do have a lot of like progressives, but just because they are progressive doesn't necessarily mean that all of them always, like the majority of them are, whether they are necessarily center or they aren't right wing. Because again, also the finance bros, also a lot of like people who are doing a lot of like commerce, who are doing like a lot of things within business, also are within these major metropolitan areas, which is why, for example, the VVD, which is like again center right, very pro economics, pro um, business, is also doing quite well in these hubs. So it shows you that there aren't necessarily clear swing states. There are clearly more swing regions, and the way that they vote historically um, is either historical, so who they used to, or based on specific policies that are dealing with their specific issues. So again, economic neglect, becoming quite gray as a society compared to like maybe having a lot of youngsters, all this kind of stuff. So it shows you that it isn't always very clear who's going to win, which makes predicting very hard. It also means that it isn't very clear where to focus on which group, because it's very diffuse. Sometimes states will, will flip from like the PVV to majoritarian and become D66 to majoritarian become like CDA, all this kind of stuff, which shows there's quite some flexibility within Dutch politics, which makes it also quite volatile policy-wise, because you might flip against the policies that are going to be changed. Again, this is all good to know when you're actually going to make discussions about elections, the unpredictability of it, but also what this does for policy wise and what this does for just the general context economically or socially within the Netherlands, where you have so much policy being changed or not being able to be implemented because you have so much changes in so many years. So, okay, it might be somewhat of a long introduction, but I hope that this does explain a lot about Dutch politics. If you have any questions, either let me know in the comments, let me know in like a DM, and then hopefully this will clarify a lot. And then in the next video, I'll talk about the VVD specifically. It will be a bit shorter of a video, and I hope you enjoyed this, and good luck debating these kind of motions. Bye.